So these are some of the components that we're going to be talking about today. ELK offers two different sizes of structured wiring enclosures, a 14-inch and a 28-inch enclosure, and then we have various plates and glides and different accessories to mount devices in the enclosure. We're going to start by talking about the SWB-14. If you've installed an M1 system, that's one of our standard kits, you're probably somewhat familiar with this enclosure. We do include it in a number of kits, and you see those part numbers listed on the screen. This is a 14 by 14 inch enclosure. It comes with a surface mount door, but there is a flush mount door available for it. So if you want to flush mount the SWB-14, you do need to order a separate door. That part number is for the flush mount door only, not an enclosure with a flush mount door, but a replacement door for the enclosure. And of course it includes the cam lock. And again, you can see the different kits from the M1 line that contain this particular enclosure. It can house an M1 Gold control, the battery, and 2 to 3 expanders. Our larger enclosure is the SWB-28. It is a 28 by 14 roughly, and it comes with a flush mount door. So this particular enclosure, when you purchase it, you're already going to get the door that you need to flush mount it. Of course, the box could be surface mounted as well, but we go ahead and give you the flush mount door with this one, and it also includes the cam lock. You can put an M1 Gold control, the battery, and 10 to 11 expanders in this enclosure, just depending on which of the mounting options you choose. We do not include this particular enclosure in any of our kits, but we do offer kits that do not have an enclosure so that you can order this larger enclosure as needed for those bigger jobs. Both the SWB-14 and the SWB-28 feature a number of knockouts along the top, sides, and bottom of the enclosure, as well as in the back of the enclosure. So there's knockouts all over the place. It just depends on your installation as to whether or not you need to come in top, sides, or through the back or the bottom. Now the bottom actually has the knockout for the electrical outlet. You'll find that particular knockout in the bottom of the box, and so that allows you to put in a J box and hook an outlet right into the SWB box there for plugging in transformers or other power supplies. So that's a convenient option that you have there if you want to use that. A lot of the knockouts are combination knockouts, so they have several different sizes that you can knock out, either a small or a larger knockout for the conduit sizes. So you want to definitely knock those out prior to installing the box, and of course you're going to find a screwdriver, hammer, that type of thing helpful in getting those out. We do offer the grommet donuts if you're going to be knocking out the larger knockout for the 1 1/4 inch conduit. We have the grommets that you can use for those to keep wires from getting nicked and scraped if you're not actually using conduit but just using the hole in the box. Those are a great option, so keep that in mind as well. One thing of note, and what this diagram here is about, if you're going to mount the M1 in the top of the enclosure, which I'll show you how that works here in just a bit, but there are 2 to 3, depending on whether we're talking about the 14 or the 28, knockouts that you can't use because the M1 actually blocks them. So when you're using the M1, it's going to be the 2 outer knockouts that you're going to be able to work with as shown in that diagram. All right, let's talk a little bit about flush mount installation. This is one of the things that we do get some questions about, some phone calls about, because you initially think flush mount is definitely going to be completely flush with the wall, but one thing that you have to keep in mind is that you have to allow some room for the door hinge, which attaches to the side of the enclosure, and I'll show you that in more detail here in just a moment. But you need to have the enclosure about 3/4 of an inch or so out from the finished wall. So that means that just depending on the depth of your wall finish, whether that be drywall or paneling or whatever it might happen to be, you could have the box around an inch or inch and a quarter, more or less there, just depending on your depth again from the stud wall when you're installing that. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. Now we have some helpful little guides. There's these little indentions in the side of the enclosure, and those appear on the top and bottom of both of the sides, and that's just to kind of give you a guide or some help there in making the proper depth adjustment. So definitely use those in making sure that you're getting the enclosure mounted where you're going to have enough room for the hinge when it gets applied. It does have these slots that I've pointed out here. Those to allow you to just loosen your screws and adjust the depth in and out without having to actually remove the fastener. So that's also convenient when you're making those adjustments. Once you've got the actual enclosure mounted into the stud wall, you'll want to install the door. And so you get some screws. They're little self-tapping sheet metal screws that you're going to run in. You're going to run those in your top and your bottom holes in the hinge on the door. Those are going to line up with some keyholes that are actually in the side of the enclosure. And so you run the screw in about halfway, stick the screw head in the keyhole and lower it down into place, and the door is hanging there. You can tighten up your screws at that point and then go ahead and put in the remaining screws. So that makes it pretty easy to get the door on and off once you look at that technique and get that down. That makes it really easy to put the door on or take it back off should you need to do that. Here again you can see that you're going to have to make some adjustments to the depth to make sure that the door is going to open and close freely. So again, just making sure that you have that about 3/4 inches from the finished wall before you install the door is going to minimize the amount of adjustments that you'll have to make afterwards. Now let's talk a little bit about how the M1 board itself mounts into the enclosure, and here we're specifically talking about the M1 Gold that comes in the black clamshell housing. If you flip the board over, you'll notice there are some keyholes in the back of the M1 plastic clamshell enclosure. Those are designed to just slip right down over some screw heads that you run into the box and make it really easy to get the board in. So you can see in the picture that I have here where those screws should go. Those are shoulder screws in that they do have that area where they're not threaded and it's not going to go down through the hole. So you just want to run those right up to the shoulder, and they're going to be located there's 2 holes already drilled in the box, and they have like a little M imprinted in the box right beside of those holes. So that's where you're going to run those. Now what I'm showing here is actually the top of the box, but what I did notice from a lot of the submissions that we got from installers, I've noticed that some installers are mounting the M1 more towards the center of the box, allowing some expanders or modules to be above and below it, and that's certainly a good way to do it if that works for your installation. But the screw heads that you see in the illustration are to mount the M1 at the top of the box, which is what we see a lot of, but there's couple of different ways you can go about doing that. Whether you're going to do it at the top of the box or more towards the center, it's the same concept of running in those shoulder screws and then just pushing the screw heads through the keyholes and pulling down on the board to get it to set into place. Now that anchors the top of the M1 pretty well, but we've also got two holes run into the bottom of that clamshell housing where you can run two more of those shoulder screws. And again, there's already holes drilled in the enclosure to accept those. And so that just keeps the board from being able to raise up off of the back of the enclosure when you're maybe pulling out the terminal blocks or a wiring harness, that sort of thing, so that it's not moving around on you. So now I want to spend a little bit of time just showing you, kind of an example of how the M1 could be mounted in the different enclosures. So we're going to start with the M1 Gold in an SWP-14. Again, you can see that the main board is mounted in the center, close to the top. Using the SWG glides, circuit board glides, we can install an expander module. We have like an input expander in the example here on the left side, and then we've got the M1XCP installed on the right side. Now the M1XCP has been taken out of its plastic housing so that it's just the circuit board, and then using the SWGs we can mount it right there on the right side, and that puts it close to the main serial port where you're going to have a connection there to the main board, between the main board and the Ethernet interface. So that can be a very convenient place to install that, for a nice neat job. Now we supply a flat ribbon cable with the M1XCP. The purpose of that being a flat ribbon serial cable is so that you can mount the M1XCP in the location shown here, have that serial cable in place, and still get the door closed. If you use a normal manufactured serial cable for that connection that has the injection molded ends on it, it's going to interfere with the door closing. So that's why we supply that flat ribbon cable, and so you want to make use of that when you're going to mount it in this location. You can have another expander device on an SWP3 plate just below the M1. You've got just space there for one of those SWP3 plates. And then there's room for the battery to sit underneath the enclosures, or excuse me, underneath the M1 as well. And whether you have the battery on the left side or the right side really is just up to you. Again, you don't really need any kind of accessory for the battery. It's going to sit right there in the enclosure. That's showing an 8 amp hour battery. It will hold up to about a 12 in the width of the bottom of the box when you're just sitting in the bottom of the box. Alright, so here's the M1 Gold in an SWP-28 enclosure, and again you can see I've in this example I've mounted the M1 up close to the top of the box, although again in some of the examples I did see it in the middle, and you could certainly do that. But if you do mount it at the top, you can see just like with the 14-inch enclosure, you can have an expander board or Ethernet interface or whatever the case may be on each side of the M1 board using the glides. And I do want to note here, this is actually an M1XSP taken out of its housing and mounted here. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on where you can mount different sized boards with these glides here in just a moment. But that's one of you can mount a small board like that here or here, but that 3.5-inch board pattern doesn't repeat in the lower part of the enclosure. There are other ways to mount the M1XSP, and again I'll get into that a little bit more here in a bit, but I actually have in this illustration an extra glide mounted here, and the purpose of doing that was just to show you can have a much longer board there. Similar to the 14-inch enclosure, you could have an input expander or an output expander or a relay board, a number of different larger expansion boards there. When you're using the SWP-28, you should use the SWS shelf for installing the battery. There is some importance there in where the battery leads run and what they can come into contact to, and I'll go in more detail on that in just a moment. But the SWS shelf will hold up to an 8 amp hour battery. The whole pattern in the SWB-28 actually repeats from the top 14 inch to the bottom 14 inches of the enclosure, and so that allows us to install more of the SWG glides across the second lower half of the board. You can see there are 4 in this illustration on the left side of the board. You could continue to have more of those going over to the right side if you prefer that mounting method. You could have up to 7 there. I'll explain to you shortly why we don't recommend putting 8 in like that, although technically the holes are there. You can do it. I'll tell you why you shouldn't do that here in just a moment. On the right side of this board, we're actually using a number of the SWP3 plates to install different modules. You can see there's a data bus hub, input expander, output expander. There are a lot of M1 accessories that work on that plate. If you happen to just prefer having the boards, mounted flat on the back as opposed to, the more like book on a shelf type situation that you get with the SWGs. Certain boards are going to mount better that way. The data bus hub is a perfect example of that because the RJ45s are sort of facing out from the board. If you were to attempt to mount that one up on its end, you're going to have more trouble getting things plugged in and out of it. It's just not going to be as convenient. And that particular part, the M1DBH data bus hub, actually comes with this SWP3 plate, so it's definitely the way that we would recommend you mount that particular product. Now we do have the larger plate that I showed on that first screen where we were looking at the different parts. The SWP is a 4 3/4 inch plate, and it's good for our larger components, or if you want to leave something in the housing. In this particular example, the item that's down there on that larger plate is actually an ELK-950, which is a surge protector. So this is a plate that you can just make use of for larger components. It has a number of holes already drilled in it that match certain board layouts, but of course with this particular plate, because it's not hollow in the middle like the SWP3, you can drill holes in it if you need to. So if you have some kind of particular component, maybe it's for integration, it's an oddly sized component, you don't see any other way to mount it in the board, definitely keep in the enclosure, keep that in mind. You can use that SWP to do that. So up to this point, the majority of what we've talked about has been the M1 Gold, but we definitely want to go over the M1 Easy 8. It is a good control that we offer when voice is not needed. The M1 Gold has a number of voice features. The M1 Easy 8 does not have, but the Easy 8 can be a good option in some of those cases where that's not needed, and it actually comes on these 2 rails that you see in the illustration here. It's already mounted on those rails, and those actually pop right into the pattern in the back of the SWB 14 and 28 inch enclosures. So really easy to install that, and you also have a lot of options as far as placement of that particular board. You can have it left side, right side, top, bottom, wherever it makes the best sense for you. Another kind of interesting thing that I was noticing when I was working with this is you can actually, the circuit board for the Easy 8 is kind of long and tall, portrait style it looks like as far as the orientation of it, but you can actually take that Easy 8 and turn it to more of a landscape orientation, and because those rails are sticking out from those shorter sides, it actually is more of a square, and it'll fit in there either way. I think the way that I have it here is probably the best way to do it, just as far as getting to the terminals, but again that may vary just depending on your installation, so very flexible in how you can get the Easy 8 to go in the enclosures. Of course, plenty of room below it to sit a battery, and then you've got room for circuit board glides and also plates to be installed here. You could probably get another set of glides in beside of the one here if you really wanted to. Now keep in mind, I've chose to not show any of these things wired just for illustration purposes. I think it was easier to see where you can put things, but you got to keep in mind that you are going to have some wires run into this, and you need to leave room for that, and definitely have good wire management, make a neat installation. So you can cram a lot in the box, but that's not necessarily always the best way to go. I would say neatness over fit, just jamming the box full is probably going to be more impressive to your customer. So now let's take a look at the Easy 8 in the 28-inch enclosure, and you can see you can get a lot of stuff in here with it. Again, I've got it oriented in more of the portrait style, but you could turn it landscape. You could put it anywhere in this enclosure that makes sense for you, because it's just using that whole pattern in the back with the little rivet plungers to mount it in. Very easy to move that board around and get it where you want it and where it makes sense for you. I would recommend the use of a battery shelf when installing the battery. You want to keep that directly below, as close to the enclosure as you possibly can, and I'll explain that a little bit more here in just a few minutes. But you can see at the top there's room for some of the shorter boards, like we have an M1 KAM and also an Ethernet interface mounted here in the top. Again, you could stick another board here, you could stick another board there if you really want to get them tied in there and you need to do that. You can certainly do that. We've got a number of the SWP-3 plates here with different expansion modules. This particular module on this plate is a smaller module, and it's the Easy 8 MSI, which is the main serial interface for the Easy 8. You're going to have just a small connection going from here over to this jack here on the Easy 8 between those two RJ45s. And then you would, if you're going to use an Ethernet interface, you're going to be going from this serial connection up to the Ethernet interface. So this particular placement would be ideal for that particular scenario or installation where you're going to have the Ethernet interface connected to an Easy 8. You can see a lot of the same stuff's in the box here that was in with the M1. It's all very modular, and the little push pin rivets make things really easy to move around. So if you find out, it would be better if it was adjusted up or down for your wire runs, that sort of thing. Very easy to move these things around on the plates. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the circuit board glides. These are really your space saver as far as mounting the modules in the enclosure with the M1. Takes advantage of that space on each side of the control board, which is great because otherwise you really wouldn't be able to do a lot up there. And again, having the Ethernet interface close to the main serial port is ideal. This particular diagram shows the different board sizes that can be mounted using the SWGs. And as I was talking about earlier, the M1 XSP is one of the smaller boards that you're going to encounter. It's a 3.5-inch board, and there's really only two positions in the enclosure that can accept a 3.5-inch, and that's going to be right here or right here. Again, directly on the left or the right side of the M1 board if it's mounted up in the center, and you can see in the diagram there it shows kind of where that's going to be mounted. The pattern repeats in the second half of the SWB28 with the exception of that 3.5-inch pattern. So you're going to get the 4, 6, 8 and so on down through the second half of the enclosure. The majority of the M1 boards that you're going to be mounting with this type of glide are 6 inches. Some of them are 4, like the Ethernet interface is 4, the CAM is 4, but like a lot of the input expanders, output expanders, those sort of things are the 6-inch size. So you can see you can have those in the top and the bottom. Now a moment ago I was talking about how the pattern, you've got a place for 4 on each side of the board. That's what the pattern allows. You can see that here in the diagram. But we don't actually recommend using this particular position that I'm showing here with my mouse, and you can see here in this illustration that I've provided. You can actually install a board there. It will fit. It's not that it won't fit. The door will close as long as your wire's not in the way, but that's the thing. If you have wires coming out of that, the cam lock is right in that area, and it could potentially pinch wires and cause problems later on down the road. There could also be some clearance issues just depending on how your wires are coming out of those terminals, or what you have mounted there. If it happens to be something with the serial port on it, that sort of thing, you could have a clearance issue. So we just recommend avoiding that area as far as mounting with glides is concerned. So that's just something to be aware of. So pinch wires is the kind of thing that gets you back out to the job site when you thought you were done with it, and nobody likes that. So another very versatile option for mounting products in the SWBs is the SWP3 plate, which I know we've talked a lot about that, but there are a lot of M1 modules that will just mount right to that, and it mounts using the nylon standoffs. I've got the part number of those listed there for you, but this particular plate does come with 4 of those standoffs, which is typically all you need to mount a board to it. But if you do happen to misplace those, or they get broken, or you need to replace them for some reason, we do sell those as a 10-pack, and that's the part number that you see here. The SWNS1 is a 10-pack of those standoffs. The other plate we've talked about today is the SWP, which is the 4 3/4 inch plate. And you can see it has a number of different hole patterns drilled into it already. It accepts the components that come in like the ABS housing, that black housing that you see some of our parts in, like the M1XSP and the 950, and some of our other products that like two-way listening interface is another example. The TWI comes in one of those. So different products from ELK that come in those black ABS housings will fit right on this plate with holes that are already there. This can also be useful if you're mounting other, system integration parts, that sort of thing. Again, there's a lot of holes already there, but if you have some kind of odd component you're trying to mount, definitely keep this in mind, because you can, drill more holes in it, definitely. So, and it uses the little plungers as well, just like the SWP3. So placement in the box is definitely flexible. You can put it in a number of different locations. We also talked a little bit about the battery shelf. As I mentioned before, that accommodates up to an 8 amp-hour battery. The 5 and the 8 both fit very well on that shelf, and that's probably the more common sizes that you're going to see with the controls. Now, the importance of this shelf is really based on a UL requirement. You can't really have long battery leads just running through your box with your other wires. UL requires a minimum of a 1/4 inch separation between non-power limited conductors like the battery leads from power limited conductors like pretty much everything else that you're connecting to the M1. So that's why it's important to use these shelves to have that battery just as close to the control where it's going to be hooked up, and those wires are not going to be, in an area where other wires are being run. So that's, again, really the importance of using the shelf, and it's also a very convenient way to mount your batteries. Here's a chart that I've provided, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on each one of these items, but these are just some of the more popular peripheral items for the M1 controls, whether we be talking about the M1 Gold or the M1 Easy 8. It just shows you, what you can mount them with, whether it be the glides or the SWP3 or the SWP. And you'll notice that the glides and the SWG glides are actually included with a number of these accessories or these peripherals. So again, when those are provided, that's definitely ELK saying, this is probably the best way to mount this, although there are other options, but that's the option that we think that is going to be the best or most popular for you. All right, one other thing that I want to point out about the enclosures, and I'm showing the SWB-28, but you'll also find two of these in the SWB-14. We've got these little flanges that stick out inside of the enclosure that allow you to loop around either a wire tie or the hook and loop strips for wire management so that you can organize the wires along the sides of the enclosure. And I've shown here in an illustration, both the wire tie and the hook and loop. I know the wire ties are really popular, quick and easy, inexpensive. A lot of people like to use those. I would, however, say, if you think that you're going to be adding or taking things out or, making changes to the things that are in the enclosure, say maybe you got the larger enclosure because you had more than 3 modules that you wanted to house there, but you're not really filling it up, but you think you might later. The hook and loop's going to, give you a reusable, adjustable solution. A little bit more expensive to get those hook and loop strips. You can find those at your local home improvement store, and they're really handy. But I just think they're great for when you're going to be making lots of changes. That's something with my test system here that I work with at the office here is constantly changing. So wire ties would just be more of a nuisance in that case. And I know that's probably not something you run into a great deal in your installations, but just something to consider, food for thought there. What we'd like to do now is go over some of the submissions that we received from some of the installers, and we really appreciate everyone sending those in. It was really interesting, great to see that that sort of material come in, and some really neat jobs. And so we'll just dive in and show you one. This actually comes from Barry in California, and this is an example of just an SWB-14. This was probably an M1 kit, and you can see he's using the data bus hub on the plate, the batteries below it. Don't really have any of the expansion modules on the sides to the board, but those could certainly be added. I'm not 100% sure what this module is, but it looks like it's been affixed or is just sitting there in the side of the enclosure. So you can also see a wireless receiver and the Ethernet interface in its plastic housing here above the enclosure. This is a submission from Dave in Pennsylvania, and this one was actually a very popular post on our Facebook page. It shows a system with 60 wired and hardwired zones, and it's being used to monitor garage doors, and it's integrated with RTI, so they're doing a lot with this system, but you can see how it's making use of the wire management along the sides of the board, battery shelf here, data bus hub, and also some of the glides. So this one's showing a lot of the different things that we've talked about here today. Now I also noticed here these are those project box type housings that the like XCP and the M1KAM come in. So Dave got creative here in mounting those to the outside of the enclosure. Now here's an example from one of our friends in Australia. Mark in Australia sent this one to us, and we actually have a sister company in Australia called Ness that sells the M1 in the Australian market, so that's what you're seeing here. I have 2 stacked SWB-14 enclosures here. And you can see a lot of great wire management in this one, and also taking advantage of the glides there, and also some of the plates. Now you'll see here this is a different plate that we didn't talk about. This is actually a Clipsal C-bus interface, and it comes on this plate. This is not a plate size that ELK offers separately, but that Clipsal interface you see just snaps right into the ELK enclosure. So great looking job there from Mark. Here's an example from Thomas in New York. This is two side-by-side SWB-28s, and you can see again, very, very neat job. Good job on the wire management, taking advantage of some of the plates, battery shelves. Not really using the glides on this one. This actually looks like the Ethernet interface has been mounted. I'm not sure. It would have been interesting to ask Thomas whether or not that's screwed into some holes that lined up, or if that's double-sided tape or something like that there. But you can see this is one of the examples where the M1 has been mounted more to the center of the box, and there are some holes already in the box that would allow that to happen. So if this makes more sense for your installation, like you see, there's just a big chunk of cables coming in here, so it may not have been possible to mount the M1 at the top in that case. So again, just another very neat job, and also shows the versatility of how you can make it work for your installation and the way you're pulling wire into the box and that sort of thing. All right, here we have a nice before and after from one of our friends, Larry, in Mississauga, Ontario. This is Rim Park Security, and they do a lot of retrofits, replacing other older systems with the M1 system. And so you can see the before is I mean, I'm just going to be honest here, that's a real mess, and the after is a really nice, well-managed job. So they just do a great job when they're doing those conversions. And here we have an SWB-14 stacked on top of an SWB-28. So again, just making use of those enclosures to house what you need, and they've got some room for expansion here should they need to do that later. Also, great job there using the battery shelf to keep those non-power limited conductors away from the power limited conductors. This example, it looks like they've attached the Ethernet interface outside of its housing to the clamshell, and again, I'm not sure whether they used a fastener like screws or something for that, or if that's double-sided tape, but that's an interesting way to mount the Ethernet interface. Ethernet interface could be mounted here with the SWG glides, but they may have had some wires and things they were pulling in that were going to be in the way there. So the point here is just the versatility and the flexibility of using these different components to mount all of the things in the enclosures. And what we love seeing, and what's been really great through this webinar, and also our Hall of Fame Make Me Famous campaign that we've been doing on Facebook for a while, is just to see some of these installations, because you installers out there are just doing a really neat job, and I just love seeing these neat ELK installations. It makes those installing companies look good and makes ELK look good, so we really enjoy seeing those. We hope that you'll continue to share these types of images with us as you continue installing systems.